Hello, my name is Austin Habish, the founder of Think Catholic, and you're listening to the Summa podcast, where we study St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae in a way simple and insightful for anyone to understand. The Summa podcast is brought to you by Think Catholic. Taking 2 questions of the Summa a day, we'll seek to summarize St. Thomas's responses, discovering the brilliance of Aquinas and his Catholic faith. This is day 68. And so let's get started. We're covering today questions 14 and 15 of the Prima Secundae, that is, of counsel, which precedes choice, and of consent, which is an act of the will in regard to the means. The translation that I always use in these podcasts is the one generously provided to me by Ave Maria Press, the 5-volume set translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province, which you can now get at a discounted price from Ave Maria Press's site by typing in the code SUMMA10. And so here we go. Article 1, whether counsel is an inquiry. The Latin here translated inquiry can also be translated investigation. So we could rephrase the question to ask, is counsel a kind of investigation? And it is, into the most suitable means to some end. We take counsel within ourselves before choosing, and we know that by experience. Aquinas gives us a succinct explanation of why that is the case in his response to this article. He writes, there is much uncertainty in things that have to be done, because actions are concerned with contingent singulars. Now in things doubtful and uncertain, the reason does not pronounce judgment without previous inquiry. Wherefore the reason must of necessity institute an inquiry before deciding on the objects of choice, and this inquiry is called counsel. St. Thomas also notes in this article, as we have in previous episodes, the dynamic interaction between the intellect and the will when it comes to human action. That although, as we mentioned in our last episode, choice is strictly speaking an act of the will, it follows upon the intellect's consideration as to what means to take. And then, when it comes to counsel, even though it is strictly speaking an act of the intellect, it must be motivated by the end desired via the will. So there is a dance, so to speak, a ballroom dance between the intellect and the will in human voluntary action, which we will see more and more apparently as we continue through the Summa. Article 2, whether counsel is of the end or only of the means. Counsel is of the means because it is motivated precisely by the already intended end. If we are investigating anything, it is precisely for the sake of something already desired. The act of investigating must have some goal intended by that investigation, and therefore counsel is always of the means. In St. Thomas's words, that which is looked upon as an end is already fixed. Consequently, as long as there is any doubt about it, it is not looked upon as an end. Wherefore, if counsel is taken about it, it will be counsel not about the end, but about the means. Article 3, whether counsel is only of things that we do. And we do well to split this question into 2 parts. The first would be asking primarily, is counsel about action? Is it inquiry into what ought to be done? And it is. It is the mind bringing into consideration not only universal truths, but also specific circumstances, specific things concerned or related to some choice we are about to make in order to attain some end. The second part of this question is asking whether counsel considers only what we as individuals do or if it includes others. To that question, St. Thomas gives the following remark. We seek counsel about the action of others insofar as they are in some way one with us, either by union of affection, thus a man is solicitous about what concerns his friend, as though it concerned himself, or after the manner of an instrument. For the principal agent and the instrument are, in one way, one cause, since one acts through the other. Thus the master takes counsel about what he would do through his servant. Article 4, whether counsel is about all the things that we do, which is not the case. We do not take counsel in things that are fixed or in insignificant things, like what time in the morning I should brush my teeth, or when it comes to fixed things, if I should send my email in English to my English-speaking boss or in another language. As it is stated in this article, a writer does not take counsel how to form his letters, like the letters of his language, for this is determined, or in things where it little matters whether it is done this way or that way. This occurs in minute matters, and reason looks upon small things as mere nothings. Article 5, whether the process of counsel is one of analysis. Here St. Thomas gives us a distinction between analytic and synthetic reasoning. He writes, to proceed from cause to effect is to proceed synthetically, but if that which precedes a knowledge is later in the order of being, the process is one of analysis, as when our judgment deals with effects, which by analysis we trace to their simple causes. So in what direction does counsel proceed? From end to the beginning, or from the beginning to the end in the order of causality? And since counsel takes for its principle or beginning the intended end or goal, the intended last effect, and then by working backwards from that starting point to discover what suitable means it should take, the process of counsel can be aptly called a process of analysis. As Aquinas says, it begins, that is to say, from that which is intended in the future and continues until it arrives at that which is to be done at once. Article 6, whether the process of counsel is indefinite. Does the process of counsel extend endlessly? And we can look at this question from the perspective of the end and the beginning of counsel, but looking at the end of counsel, which is the goal, just as in the way a chandelier cannot be held off the ground by an endless series of chain links above it, without some definite, singular, ultimate ceiling, so too counsel cannot even begin without a very definite, singular end or goal. Whether that be our ultimate goal, which is happiness, or any proximate middle goal, which is then ordered to that last end. Also looked at from the perspective of the beginning of counsel, which is our act of reasoning. Counsel cannot be indefinite because we ourselves are a very definite, singular, thinking thing with a very definite beginning. And so looked at from either the perspective of the beginning or the origin of the act of counsel, which is us, or from the end or goal to which counsel is directed, counsel is in no way indefinite. And on to question 15 of consent, which is an act of the will in regard to the means. Article 1, whether consent is an act of the appetitive or of the apprehensive power. Apprehensive powers would be things like sight, hearing, understanding. Appetitive powers would be like desire, hope, volition. So which of these categories does the act of consent fall under? Aquinas writes, consentire, to consent, is to feel with, literally. And this implies a certain union to the object of consent. Hence the will to which it belongs to tend to the thing itself is more properly said to consent. And as we work through these articles, it is helpful, I believe, to immediately distinguish consent from choice, which was our last episode. To do that, St. Thomas gives us the following. He writes, choice includes something that consent has not, namely, a certain relation to something to which something else is preferred, and therefore, after consent, there still remains a choice. In other words, although I can have a certain approval of various different optional means towards an end, choice adds a relation of the will to the preferred option, to the best means to that end, which was among the options of which had already fallen under my consent. And this is an important distinction. So to quote St. Thomas specifically, he says, for it may happen that by aid of counsel, several means have been found conducive to the end, and through each of these meeting with approval, consent has been given to each. But after approving of many, we have given our preference to one by choosing it. And so with that being said, we continue with our articles. Article 2, whether consent is to be found in irrational animals. And this is not the case because they are lacking the freedom of the will. Animals do not have a kind of possession of themselves which is requisite to give or not give consent. They are simply determined by natural instinct. Aquinas writes briefly, the irrational animal is not properly said to consent. This is proper to the rational nature, which has the command of the appetitive movement and is able to apply or not to apply it to this or to that thing. Article 3, whether consent is directed to the end or to the means. The key to this question is the fact that consent, according to St. John Damascene, takes place when a man approves and embraces the judgment of his counsel. So as consent comes after counsel, since counsel pertains to the means, as we mentioned in this episode already, then so does consent. St. Thomas gives us the following explanation. First, there is the apprehension of the end, then the desire of the end, then the counsel about the means, then the desire of the means. To those things which come under consideration after the last end, insofar as they are directed to the end, they come under counsel. Consequently, since counsel is only about the means, consent, properly speaking, is of nothing else but the means. And if that process seems a little foggy, it may be worth returning to episode 64 and then listening to the ones that follow it up to this one. Article 4 in our last article, whether consent to the act belongs only to the higher part of the soul. Does consent belong only to those highest immaterial faculties of the soul? And they have to, because it is in the will that moral blameworthiness or praise finds its root. As Augustine says, it is impossible for man to make up his mind to commit a sin unless that mental faculty which has the sovereign power of urging his members to or restraining them from act yield to the evil deed and become its slave. So consent to evil requires a kind of freedom which must rise above the material world. That is the freedom of the entirely immaterial intellectual appetite, which is the will. And so the act of consent, as being worthy of blame or praise, must take its root in that part of our soul which allows for culpability, which is in the intellectual faculties. And that is all for this episode as we continue to encounter the surprisingly intricate dynamic interplay between the intellect and the will in the process of human action. We have just finished covering questions 14 and 15 of the Prima Secundae, that is, of counsel, which precedes choice, and of consent, which is an act of the will in regard to the means. My name is Austin Habish with Think Catholic, and I cannot wait to see you tomorrow.